I think I lived my life in a series of boxes. And then the financial crisis hit, right? So, which kind of gutted everything. It's a really romantic industry in that it can only transfer from person to person. I had to tell them, we're terminating your contract. I was just the axe man. It hurt. You need to be cognizant of the emotional well-being of the people that you care for. Defend your position on vision and purpose and stand behind that. You also, as a leader, need to be comfortable with the lack of certainty, but caring and compassionate enough that you're managing with a sense of humanity. And oftentimes that's lost in Excel sheets and P&Ls and balance sheets. Don't be afraid to say the difficult thing. The worst thing you can do in any business context or otherwise is be.
In this episode of Sports and Outdoor Mentors, I chat with Noah Reis, the Senior Managing Director of Snow Peak North America and Europe. We talk about Noah's early career and motivations, the light bulb moment when he decided to join Snow Peak, and the most challenging time in his career, plus much, much more. Before we begin the episode, I have one request. Less than 50% of people watching or listening now are subscribed. So please hit the subscribe or follow button so we can inspire and provide valuable insights to even more people. Thanks for your support and enjoy the episode. Noah, so after studying both chemistry and psychology, your career started in the travel industry, where I believe you spent 4 years. And then from that, 4 years in KPMG, so in one of the big top four. And then you joined Snow Peak. So I'm really interested to understand in your words, what were the key elements over your life that got you there? Because that's not necessarily, let's say, a traditional entry point into the sports and outdoor industry. So I'm really interested to understand what are the key moments in that journey.
I was born in upstate New York. My dad's American, mom's Japanese. Moved to Japan when I was 3 and lived in Japan until I was 18. Went to uni in about an hour outside of Boston, Massachusetts. That's where I studied psychology and chemistry. And when I got into psychology, what I wanted to be able to do was channel how I thought about life and the energy, and how could I help other younger folks guide it. And I didn't come out of it necessarily bridging that gap, and I knew that I would have to get a doctorate in it. So it was either, go into psychology and leverage my chemistry degree and find the best way to prescribe pills to people. But that was not necessarily a route that I was wanting to go down. So at that point in time, my next thought was, well, if I really want to be that cultural gap, then naive and romantic little me was thinking, what's more analogous and directly translating into that than the travel industry? I decided to go down the travel route, particularly because the leader of that Japanese company, it was a Japanese company in New York. Their CEO was a Korean gentleman. The director of sales was an Indian gentleman. And the general manager of the location was a white man. So from a cultural and a diversity perspective, I instantly felt that I would be able to make an impact. There was a change in the mechanics. There was an underlying mechanical problem in how the business models were set up, while there was upheaval in the industry distribution mechanics from an online agency, undercutting margins, etc. So that was when I joined. And then the financial crisis hit, right? So, which kind of gutted everything. But it was interesting because the sales director at the time, he was certainly a visionary within the company. And he wanted to transition us from a wholesaler on specific international routes to stabilizing our P&L and our balance sheet by turning into a travel management company. So Nissan or Toyota, you spend annually $200 million on travel. How do we take this portfolio of travel and optimize, streamline, and so manage your costs downwards so that everybody's booking within policy? You risk manage so that you know where all your travelers are. If they're traveling to the Congo or something, for example, do you have the right insurance in play? So those types of management services to stabilize the revenue stream of our firm, right? So we were trying to create a value-add service at the time. The challenge that I realized in the back end of it was, one, I was still facilitating a transaction.
Yeah.
Travel portfolios are typically 3 to 5% of any company's expense line item. So it's not a significant chunk, right? It's one thing to get people to get them over there. It's another thing to immerse somebody in a culture and actually understand and come away from that experience significantly better, right? And that's about the quality of the experience. Whereas all I was doing for in that industry was getting people from point A to point B.
Yeah.
But that led me to doing a MBA in Manchester University. The reason I selected KPMG was a couple of different reasons, but I'm sure, many of you or your listeners may be familiar with different consulting firms that are out there. There's the strategic consulting firms like the McKinsey, the BCGs of this world. There's the IT consultants, and then there's management consultants, right? That kind of sit between that connection point between strategy and execution. And that really appealed to me because a lot of times, it can easily be a consultant's report is on your desk and it's on you to execute, but a lot of times you don't necessarily know how to turn the dials, right? So how do you translate an idea into practice when maybe culturally your people, your processes, your systems, or even your customers don't really get it? And how do you bring those things together was kind of why I chose KPMG. That and they gave me a job offer letter, which was pretty nice. Yeah, for sure. So that's why I chose KPMG. But I also chose to move back to Japan at that point in time.
Okay.
A lot of the stuff that I worked on there was, strategy for energy industry, and after the Fukushima national disaster, there just wasn't enough power supply. So how do you look at open trade markets for energy in Japan? And we knew that was going to come online. Yeah. So as instead of firing up another coal power plant, in Western markets, they trade demand response, right? So reduction in demand. So like, how do you turn down the AC at your office building and treat that as actual capacity gained in the system? So there was different ways of thinking about the marketplace where we worked out with some of those regional players, talking about how that may impact their current market, et cetera. Worked a lot with the financial industry. Okay. And I spent probably 3 years or so working on a major merger project for an international insurance company, which was really quite challenging. It was a lot of working from 8 a.m. to midnight and having to present to the board the next day on the status of the merger, and they invested close to certainly in the hundreds of millions of dollars. In terms of actually pulling off the merger. But they put me in a role where I was actually responsible for the delivery. And it gave me a taste of, obviously one, working with really incredibly smart executives who knew their business and knew what they needed to achieve in that space, but also working with people that really wanted to make a change, and that's not always every day that in a consulting job that you get exposed to that. Right. And it really, made me realize that I wanted to be responsible for my own change in the world. Yeah. And as a consultant, you're always guiding people to the more efficient or profitable solution, but you're not necessarily. It's not your intent. Yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah. You're manifesting somebody's intent and translating that into how do you build that into practice. Yeah. But I was doing my job without my own set of intentions. Okay. And I think that was something that I really wanted to change. And I'd harbored that desire to get out of consulting. That's probably, not an unfamiliar story, sure. But that was certainly one component of it. So I was, I have a buddy of mine who works in the financial sector as well. And he'd been contacted by former boss, I believe, about Snow Peak was looking for a CFO, and would you be interested? Our Snow Peak's headquarters is located in Niigata, Japan. It's about 2 hours outside of Tokyo, in a pretty snowy, rainy part of the country. And he's like, no, I don't do snow. And he knew I snowboarded, so he was saying, Noah, are you interested? And said I'd give it a go. My only real exposure to the outdoor industry was really snowboarding. But I was going into a camping ground where I'd never camped before, really. For all practical intents and purposes, outside of that one college camping trip or something like that, was my background and exposure to camping at the point in time. But I met our current CEO, Toru Yamai, and reading their financial reports and their annual reports, it really struck a chord with me that this company wanted to do more than just churn product. The vision and intent and purpose-driven nature of Snow Peak certainly stood out to me, and that kind of took me aback. That stuck with me in terms of, our CEO wanted to do something much different than pure play, focus on function, turn the fastest amount of product and see what comes out of it. They were certainly striving for much more. And there was a certain sense of humanity and humility that comes with that. And over the years, that's certainly something I've, taken to. And so I jumped in both feet. And I think, I suppose part of me was chasing a position, which was certainly from a consulting point of view, a step up for me. So I was, happy with the position, but it led me to actually finding out a lot more about myself, and what I've learned and what I've experienced certainly has made me realize that it's something that we as modern humans actually need to get more people engaged in. And how do we grow the pie of the outdoor industry? Because I think certainly, going outdoors is kind of an antidote and not necessarily counterculture, but that is juxtaposed to our rapidly digitizing age, right? And it's certainly an antidote for a lot of us that we need.
I know a lot of people that, as you did, you took the decision to kind of go back to education when you did your MBA. When you look back on that, can you clearly identify now value that you gained from that experience? Because it's interesting, you said that you chose it because you felt it would almost be a little bit more practical than some of the more traditional US-based MBAs, which I think is super interesting because a lot of the times, as you said, it can be very theoretical and not necessarily very practical. So I'm interested that when you kind of look back at that time, does that still provide you value today, would you say, in your role?
I mean, I suppose please don't take it as a negative on the U.S. industry, on the U.S. institutions, because I think they're all, I'm sure they're fantastic institutions, and I applied to a number of them as well. But I think for me, in the change that I was trying to make in my life, the European model, and particularly Manchester's model, really spoke to me as having something that I could claim my own. And I think that's really important, right? Because, there's a dime a dozen MBAs, but, I know accounting, yeah, but every MBA knows accounting. Like, can you point to a specific experience where you leveraged it? And that was what the program as its format provided. Now, to your question around, when I look back on it now, I think it was the experience that I needed. Was it particularly the value? I mean, coming from the industry, I think it comes down to the purpose and your intent of going to the MBA. For me, it was a step in the door. And, you know, you could in a way say, I learned the jargon and I got an access pass. You know, I was given a ID card to the door. So for that purpose and the seat I'm in now, is it something that I have any issue with? Did I think I'd lost value going to the MBA? Or I certainly don't think so. And I'm very appreciative of my time there. Could I have gotten more out of different programs? Potentially. But for my intents and purposes, it was, I think, precisely where I needed to be.
And as you mentioned, you've lived and worked and studied in the US, in Japan, in the UK. So what experience of living, working, studying in those cultures has that influenced your approach to leadership?
I think the core tenets are the same. How precise can you be about your vision? And how much authenticity can you put behind your words, I think, is the same in any culture. I think the approach beyond that is oftentimes different. Japanese people tend to be, you know, a lot more granular in their approach. They tend to be more cautious in the number of gates that they put up before they're confident with the decision. Whereas in the US and the UK, it's more, is the concept right? Let's roll it out at 8%. A very tech Silicon Valley type of mentality. Whereas in Japan, it's, you know, have we covered off the insurance position on this? Have we made sure if our customer complains in this scenario, what do we do? So it's a very different approach to bring something online from a business point of view. But I think the core of it being about articulation and passion and authenticity, that I think is global. A lot of times, you know, how you roll that out to your staff, it starts there, right? I think as I've transitioned to Portland and my role with Snow Peak now, one of the things that I'm, I guess, kind of working through is how to be vocal and when to be vocal. In Japanese culture, you kind of wait your turn. And there's always, you know, a point in time, certainly during meetings, et cetera, where it's like, Noah, what do you think, et cetera. Whereas in the U.S. culture, it's more kind of a free-for-all of idea of exchange. So it's whereas, you know, in Japan, it's about the facilitator and how do you gather opinions from multiple different people. In U.S., it's here's the topic, everybody jumps in at once, right? So there's a timing balance that I'm still working through in terms of when do I articulate and interject my thoughts. Because I think my mentality is certainly much more Japanese in terms of how I approach those conversations. So I'm still trying to find the balance for myself in terms of how does that style and my articulation and when do I interject in terms of my voice make the most sense when I try and bridge the cultural gaps is where I think I'm still working through the kinks in my style. But at its core of being, you know, heart first, and head second is always been, I suppose, a part of me. And I think that approach always translates because it starts with the emotional connection, right?
Absolutely.
So that has never been the challenge. It's more the practicalities and the process, knowing the different thought processes, but making sure that in a meeting's context, how do you draw the best out of people? While also finding and balancing your voice, right? So, and that balance always changes depending on the culture. So that's something that I'm still working through.
When you look back over the career, who are the people that would you say have influenced you the most?
3 people, I think, that I can really credit. The first one was my Indian boss at my travel management company. He pushed the company to change in an industry that was heavily reliant on, or at least our company that was heavily reliant on incentive cash outs for about 40-50% of our revenues, to transition that into a travel management company where we balance our intake with the service we provide. He wanted the vision to come to reality, but he wasn't afraid of the legwork to make it happen, right? Because he believed in it. And that was certainly an influential component there. He also, made sure that I had my own leeway in exploring what I wanted to do within it. In the best sense, a very authentic leader that I got to see firsthand. And I credit him with a lot of the lessons that I still take today. The second person was one of my, I don't know if I can qualify this as a mentor, but certainly was one of my best friends to this day that I went to the MBA with, who saw the potential, I guess, that I had. And he actually did a page 1 rewrite of my resume going into all my consulting interviews. He helped me connect a little bit more my head with my heart, I suppose. So he facilitated that. And the third, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about Toru, our current CEO. I mentioned earlier that he was certainly managed with a sense of humanity. He has a larger than life vision. And I guess I'll give one example. When COVID hit, the first thing he did when Japan went into lockdown, he called all of us board of directors in and we don't know how long this thing's going to last. There is a 30% chance that Snow Peak goes bankrupt. The first thing I want to do is I'm going to cut my salary by 50%. Will you join me in cutting your salary 20% so that we can save our employees? And I think that's an incredible gesture to make, right?
What's the most valuable piece of advice you've ever been given professionally?
So we were negotiating a deal with a different sales partner, and we were struggling to land the plane. And we were coming at it from different angles. And the first thing he said is, Noah, the most difficult thing or the most important thing in business is say the difficult thing first. Because unless you do so, you are never going to have a chance to face the same direction. And a lot of times we don't know how slippery that slope is until you find out where you've ended up 5 years down the line and you've got to change your business model or something like that. So I think what is important is at the beginning, knowing what your intent is, where the vectors are different, but being open about it. And I think a lot of times we're afraid to do so at the start. And it's tough, but the second you do that, who's going to stay in your corner or who's willing to still have the conversation with you. And at the end of the day, at least you know where they stand, even if a deal doesn't come out of it. Yeah. And that's okay. Yeah. I'd much rather work with a partner that wants to be there than a person that's, angling for a brand position or a better deal on a transaction, because that relationship's going to fall apart in half a year, a year. So from that point of view, I think it's saying the difficult part out loud and starting with it.
Good advice. So as a leader of an international business, what would you say is your most important task?
It goes back to how reiterating the vision. I think it's really important that we continue to articulate that vision, purpose, and our intentions all the time. And I think, from my seat, I'm not going to be able to control the day-to-day of our sales department or the operations, the finance, the HR. How do you put intentionality behind first our brand and first and foremost our purpose? We start there, but how do you build out your processes that support that in subsequent layers, right? So for example, we do annual camping with our customers, and we want our employees to connect with our campers, because that's fundamentally important to see the camper that you're sitting across from enjoying this time and year over year interacting with the same family, because you see them grow. You see the family that maybe was sitting around that restaurant table all looking at their smartphones. 2 years down the line, their smartphones are in their bags, you know? The kids are cooking pancakes and the dad's arguing over how to mix the batter. I don't know. And mom's squeezing orange juice and the toddler's in the back, you know? And you see families transform over time. And we're privileged as a brand that we have a following like that in our communities that we can see at all times, right? But it's important that our employees have their own story to tell in somebody else's camping journey. So you know, that's, well, I guess, I'm sorry, I'm going a little off target here, but I guess what I'm saying to answer your question is, are we articulating that vision and authenticity at our core? Are we letting our employees experience it as part of their job on as close to a daily, you know, level as we can? Are we designing policies that facilitate them taking their own journey if they want to go deeper into the lifestyle that we espouse? So, you know, in the U.S., we've just designed an HR policy that gives impact days for them to go volunteer for their charity of choice, or do anything else. But the twist being, it has to be correlated with bringing somebody else outdoors for the first time.
Okay. Great. Yeah.
So things like that are practical ways that we've tried to take our mission, vision, and purpose and try and instill it and facilitate it for our employees. It's, you know, it's always a work in progress. I don't think there's any silver bullet for something like that. But for us, we're fortunate that we're very a community-focused brand, and our activity, our core activity is so clear that we can rally around that core and engage with our community. And thankfully, they are as engaged as they are. That our employees get a firsthand experience to learn from our customers.
It's clear by listening to you that you're very passionate about the outdoors and maybe even beyond the outdoors, let's say nature. But beyond the obvious kind of day-to-day connection with, you know, working for Snow Peak, how important is the outdoors and nature to you, and how do you live that? Because if I picked up on something you said earlier on, I think as a kid you said, like, okay, you know, you went like camping once or twice, so it maybe wasn't something that you grew up with necessarily. So I'm just interested to know now, you know, how has it become so important? Why is it so important? And, you know, how do you kind of interact and live that outside of the, let's say, the necessities of what you do for your role?
Sure. I mean, I guess looking back on my childhood, I think my fondest memories was my dad was a professor.
Okay.
So we had really
chemistry.
No.
Okay.
Linguistics.
Okay.
So naturally, he had a very long summer vacation.
Okay.
And him being American, we always spent, you know, from, I want to say like the first week of July until the last week of August in the U.S. And he'd be doing exchange student teaching, et cetera, and have a summer job. But we were fortunate that we got to stay in, you know, the universities that he taught for would have these estates and would be able to put us up. And the place we were in was called Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania. And they used to have this giant estate that was a couple of, you know, 100 acres or whatever it was. I don't know the exact dimensions, but as a kid, it was massive, you know. And one of my fondest memories is every summer I'd be able to go there. And there was nothing to do, but, you know, we stayed in what was called the gardener's cottage. And it was just giant field where, you know, me and my friends would just run around, climb trees, you know, run through the meadow, get stung by bees maybe. There'd be blackberry bushes, so we'd go picking blackberries and just engaging with the rhythms of nature, right? And I think those were some of my fondest memories growing up. Fast forward to, you know, post-university travel industry, MBA, consulting. I think the mentality that I found myself in, living in Tokyo in a tiny apartment, I read a quote from one of Kengo Kuma's, I guess, his annual collection book or something like that. He was talking about how architecture in the 20th century was based around the box. I think I lived my life in a series of boxes. I went from my tiny apartment in Tokyo, rode the subway to my cubicle, went back home on the subway, got back home, went to a pub, really, a local pub, and rinsed and repeated, right? And in other words, what I'm saying is I didn't know how to live outside of civilization's boxes. I lived exclusively within an urbanized, developed context, right? And I'd lost some of that boyish wonder of running purely in the field. And it was after joining Snow Peak and going camping for about a year that, my drive through rural Japan changed. What I saw outside of my window of rice paddies and mountain ranges used to be a pretty postcard. It was very much an other to me. It was not livable space. I didn't see myself engaging with it beyond scenery, right? But after camping for a while, that scenery changed into livable space. It changed into, I can pitch a tent there with my family. Yeah. I can run in that field and experience the stars and the joy and the wonder that I had as a child. It turned into livable space, right? And I think when you think about it in an abstract sense, like in Japan, only 10% of the land is livable or inhabitable. The rest of it's nature and mountain ranges, right? I lived myself exclusively in that 10% of that landmass, and 90% of it just opened up to me, right? And I think that's a metaphor for how often we live in society in a really constrained way, where we think about, where do I live? Who do I work for? What do I make? Who are the famous people I know? All these relative cues that tell you where you are today. Those are very relative societal cues of your self-worth. But if you start to base yourself and your sense of self-worth exclusively on that, I think that's extremely dangerous, especially as a father of 2 kids. I think it's, more and more so skewed with social media, where it's about the number of likes, right? And I don't want my children to grow up in a world where they judge themselves and who they are based on what everybody else tells them they are. And I think fundamentally with nature, you're always going to be judged in the absolute. You didn't bring enough water, you're an idiot, first off, but beyond that, it tells you, right? Like it's the constraints we live under, and that's always apparent under nature. Whereas in society, the only limiting factor really is the financing and the transaction. But in nature, you're taught in the absolute who you are. Sitting around a campfire, it's how do you interact with the person in front of you, right? And that connection tells you about who you are in the absolute, as opposed to the facade we all put on. And I think that's the unlock that I learned through Snow Peak and through camping, and what it's meant for me to go outdoors. And it's not a message that I'm willing to compromise for my kids. Yeah. So that's something that's certainly very, very important to me.
I fully agree. But I always think it's easier to say it than do it, sure. Especially, in a role like yours, where I guess you're traveling a reasonable amount.
That's a mild way of putting it. Thanks for making it feel, thanks for putting the Band-Aid on.
Yeah, there we go. I'm here to help. So you're traveling a lot from the US to Europe, sure. The US to Japan, and probably a little bit in between as well.
Yeah.
You've got when you are at home, you've got a senior role, a senior leadership role. You have a family, you have 2 kids.
Yep.
Is there any non-negotiables or kind of boundaries, or I don't want to say rules, but something you do to ensure that you are able to live what you just described? Because sure. I've been in those situations where we all got into this industry because we loved it, or a lot of people, most people did. But you very quickly can realize, well, hang on a minute, I'm not actually doing what I was passionate about in the first place. So any kind of advice for making sure that you can live by that as well?
I suppose I'm lucky enough in that Snow Peak. So we do annual campouts with our customers, three times in the U.S. In Japan, we do it, over 20, 30 times a year. And I think we camp with more than, 8,000, 10,000 users on any given calendar year, right? And it's open to bringing your family. It's open to bringing your significant others or your kids along. Because it really is fundamentally a family event in that sense. And we're fortunate enough that we're able to and allowed to bring our kids, and it's actually effectively encouraged. So that's certainly a positive. I haven't been able to do that as much in the past year because I was busy moving my family over the Pacific. But certainly this year, that is my intent. I fully intend to actually 3 weeks, end of May. It's my daughter's birthday, an early part of May. So I'm taking them as well as all their school friends camping. And it's going to be a freaking nightmare for me, as I'm probably
I'm not sure that's going to be so relaxing, but okay.
I'm probably doing all the setup for the tents. I mean, no, I'm kidding. I mean, we've got several campers on their side as well. Yeah. So you're right in that, at times when I'm traveling, like this week in the UK, my thoughts go out to my family and my wife, who's living in the U.S. for the first time in her life and has been for the last year. And I'm asking her to manage the kids for a week, and my kids being 5, I wonder at times, like, what am I missing? But the other side of it is how intentional can I be with my time when I have it with them? Absolutely. And, for me, it's I have to commit to taking them camping every week. But I am fortunate in that Snow Peak does help facilitate that we go out with the family. And, certainly that's an intent, an intention that I have for the year, so that I can at least practice what I preach, but also be really intentional with my time and my limited time with my kids being the age they are. That moment's never going to come again. So,
what's the most challenging situation you've had to manage in your career?
The most recent one that comes to mind is certainly the start of COVID. Yeah. In Snow Peak, I started off in corporate planning, and then we had challenges in the supply chain, so they were assigned me supply chain. And right at the start of COVID, I transitioned back into corporate planning. So I was in charge of, putting together our budgets and forecasts and midterm plans and dealing with shareholders, stakeholders, etc. right at the start of COVID. And, again, obviously at the end game, COVID was a great, boost for the outdoor industry at large. But at the beginning of it, it forced us to really take a hard look at ourselves, right? Starting with that story I shared earlier of, cutting our CEO, cutting executive pay in half, and me and the other directors cutting our pay by 20% was where we started. And at the same time, in those 3 months of lockdown, because nobody could go camping, nobody was buying gear. I mean, there was some online sales here and there, but, because you couldn't actually physically go on and experience the product. And it was extremely, I think our sales were down, I want to say like 30, 40, 50% year over year globally for those 3 months during, lockdown in Japan. And it forced us to take a look at every single business unit, every single channel, every single product, and reanalyze what fit our business and what changes we needed to make. And it was a tough go, like some of the businesses you pour your heart and soul into, and at the same time when you break it down, you realize that you've got to turn off the lights on some things. Some of these stores that we've been operating for a while, etc. We knew that as a business model that needed to change, or the restaurant that we had over there. So going through that exercise and knowing that you spent the last couple of years building it up, but now you've got to tear it down potentially, is a tough thing to face. But as business leaders, it's something that you got to live with too, right? And during that process, very similarly last year in the U.S., we built during our midterm plan in COVID, we built our business plan to be much bigger than we were. We overstaffed. Our revenues, took a downward trend post-COVID, and we had to right-size the business. And that meant laying off employees, and that sucked.
The most difficult thing.
It sucked. Yeah, it sucked. And I'd just been moved to the U.S. for 6 months, and it's a smaller team of like 40 and 50 people. I'm looking at it. I don't really have relationships with these folks yet. And I had to tell them, we're terminating your contract. Sure, I can talk about it from a financial perspective, but without having a relationship with them, I was just the axe man. Yeah. And as a leader, feeling inauthentic in that moment, it hurt.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm getting visibly a little tore up here, but
but it's normal. It's the most difficult thing I think any leader has to do.
But dealing with the reality that you can fail, but it's okay. I wanted to be in all those meetings where we laid people off, because I think, at least with a small team like that, if I wasn't willing to swing the axe, I don't deserve this chair. Feeling how powerless I felt in that moment, I'm still, to a degree, processing through. Mm. You need to be cognizant of the emotional well-being of the people that you care for. Yeah. And I think that's something that you have to live with.
If you care, it's a very difficult thing to do. Yeah, but it's also the nature of the beast, unfortunately. I've been on both ends of that situation. Yeah, we learn through difficult situations, whether we're directly impacted or whether we're the person that is, delivering the news.
At that personal stage where, we had to make that decision, etc. I just landed in the U.S., 6 months ago, and I think I was dealing with my own, immaturity in that sense, where I had certainly outsized expectations of, certainly I saw the potential of the U.S. market. Our aspirations in Snow Peak are huge. And I think, I had conflated that vision with my sense of what I could achieve, and I'd set the bar too high on myself. And so, I was really disappointed that we couldn't get the business to that phase. Obviously 6 months is not enough. It's not a fair measuring stick or a fair measuring amount of time to speak about what I'm able to achieve. And the decision to hire these folks predates me, but it doesn't change the fact that, I had to make that decision and look those people in the eye, And so I think I was dealing personally with a sense of conflating my expectations of what we could achieve in the market with how I was measuring my own success in my new role for the 6 months. Yeah. Couple that with, having to let people go that I didn't personally have a relationship with, and that was tough. Yeah. But I think, again, what I took from it, and maybe again I'm getting ahead of you here, but it you have to be willing to defend your position on vision and purpose and stand behind that and be authentic to it at all times. But you also, as a leader, need to be comfortable with the lack of certainty,
Yeah. Yeah.
but caring and compassionate enough that you're managing with a sense of humanity. And oftentimes that's lost in Excel sheets and P&Ls and balance sheets. And but I think it was a really, really, it's weird to say at, my age that, it was a formative experience, but it's certainly, from a professional standpoint,
Yeah.
it certainly has been.
Yeah. Lighter topic. So what's your favorite piece of sports and outdoor gear? And it cannot be.
And it cannot be Snow Peak. Right? I saw that, and I was hoping you were joking about it.
And just because you're now drinking out of a Snow Peak bottle, don't think that, we're going to fall for that. Subliminal messaging.
I think one of my favorites, I do love my snowboard.
Okay. Cool.
And certainly to an unhealthy degree.
That's good.
I do. So I have a Jones Storm Chaser snowboard from 2015, I want to say.
Okay.
A lot of fond memories with the board.
What book would you advise somebody to read if they wanted to work as a leader in the sports and outdoor industry?
A book that I really found inspiring and was recommended to me was a friend was The Good Rain by Timothy. The last name is blanking on me.
The Good Rain.
The Good Rain. So it's a story about somebody's. It's the author's personal journey. Yeah. Of loss in the family, and how do you deal with the loss of a loved one, while following the Lewis and Clark Trail from way back, and then going into the history and the topography and the ecology of that specific region. And I came away from it, just kind of inspired by his personal journey and relationship to the outdoors, and what he took from it, and how he was able to, use nature to reflect on himself. I think a lot of times when we go out into nature, we actively are trying to conquer it or use it as a sport. But he used it as a tool to reflect on himself, and using nature as a measuring stick and as a mirror for who you are in that moment in time and how you're dealing with it. And I think it's those passions that kind of stuck with me. Yeah. So The Good Rain.
Okay, great. I'll find the name of the author.
And the other one that has been useful to me, as working in these global contexts, is the Culture Map.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've heard of that one. Yeah. Was really inspiring one. The other one more that I was thinking of, I think it was The Power of Habit. And so the book did a good job of really picking apart the different habits.
If you could give future leaders of the sports and outdoor industry 3 pieces of advice, what would they be?
It's a really romantic industry in that it can only transfer from person to person. You are not going to go fly fishing tomorrow on your own. You could do. It starts there as a leader. Do you have an authentic story of why the outdoors means something to you? Because we're all trying to grow that pie. But if you can't inspire with your own story, then you've lost your ability to take that first person with you. Yeah. And so I think, it's, I'm not saying that everybody has to have a sob story or, something that's going to get everybody rah-rah about it, but like a way to articulate why you do what you do and what's important about it to you is certainly, I think, the first step. Okay. I think the second thing that I'd say would be, don't be afraid to say the difficult thing, as we were talking about earlier. The worst thing you can do in any business context or otherwise is be afraid of the thing that fears you most. Yeah. The last one would be, in this day and age, the compassion or the humanity. Being willing to show your humanity is probably more important than ever. We get wrapped up in leading the charge and being the first tip of the spear. But we have to be willing to change our approaches from leading from the front, and that's sometimes what you have to do. Facilitating from the middle, you have to be willing to do that, or making sure that everybody's herded from the back, and you have to be willing to switch your approaches for the context that you're in, but you have to be willing to be vulnerable to start there. I mean, any firm is, and I'm sure you know this, like it's not the person that's leading the charge, but it's the person that's in the back that defines how fast you go, right? So you need to be willing to switch your approaches as a leader in any context. But you have to be willing to be vulnerable if that's the case. Because there's things that you are not as good at as the other people. And the world has changed as rapidly as it has. And you're not going to have all the answers. And that's okay.
So if today was your last day at Snow Peak, what would your message be to your team?
First off, it'd be thank you. Because I have learned so much at Snow Peak. Through the relationship to nature that it's afforded me, and it's fundamentally changed my perspective on my life. I guess I'd say thank you to my customers, because they have taught me by showing me and giving us a window into their lives of how their life has changed. And I got to see a very condensed version of that over the last 5 years, where they've taught me different things about the worth and the love and the change.
Great. Well, thank you very much for giving up some of your time when you're in the UK to speak. No, I really appreciate it. I think you have a really interesting career path and journey. So thanks for sharing. I hope you enjoyed the episode. And if you did, please leave a comment below. A new episode will go live in 2 weeks, so subscribe to be sure you don't miss it. Thanks again for your support, and see you soon.